There is a specific kind of loneliness that only exists inside a crowded house. Not the loneliness of an empty room. Not the loneliness of a person with nowhere to be. The loneliness of standing in your own hallway, surrounded by people who have come because someone died, and realizing that not one of them is going to ask you the question you actually need someone to ask. Callum Whitmore knew that loneliness by the time he was 12 years old. By the time he was 31, standing in the entrance hall of Whitmore Hall on the morning his father's body was being prepared upstairs, he had become so fluent in it that he could perform the opposite of it without effort. He could work a room. He could receive condolences with the right amount of gratitude and the right amount of composure. He could pour whiskey for his father's associates and ask about their journeys and nod at exactly the right moments. He had been doing it for 3 days. What nobody in that house knew, what Callum had told nobody, was that 3 weeks before Edmund Whitmore died, the woman he was supposed to marry had left him over breakfast. No scene, no raised voices. Genevieve Harlow had placed her coffee cup down on the kitchen table, looked at him with an expression he could not quite name even now, and said she had been thinking about it for a while. He had asked what, specifically, she had been thinking about. She said us. She left before he finished processing what that meant. The apartment had been hers first. He had his bags out by Thursday. He had carried that, the ended engagement, the Thursday bags, the coffee cup she had set down with such careful finality, through every one of the 14 days of his father's dying, through the hospital visits, through the calls with the solicitors, through his mother's quiet, exhausted grief, through his brother Piers arriving from Edinburgh and filling rooms with noise the way Piers had always filled rooms with noise. He had carried it in his coat pocket like a stone. He kept touching to confirm it was still there. He told no one. The night before the funeral, the house was still full. Edmund Whitmore had been a man of consequence, not in the way that generates headlines, but in the way that generates obligations. People owed him things. People had worked for him. People had needed things from him and now needed things from his estate and now needed, in some secondary way, to be seen paying their respects. The drawing room was warm and the whiskey was good and the conversation was the specific kind of conversation that happens in houses like Whitmore Hall when someone important has died. Measured, appropriate, occasionally genuine. Callum had excused himself from it. He was in the library, sitting in the chair his father had always sat in, which felt like an act of either inheritance or transgression, and he had not decided which. A glass of whiskey on the side table that he had not touched. The fire was low. The room smelled the way it had always smelled, old paper and wood smoke and something faintly mineral that he had never been able to identify and had stopped trying. He was not thinking about anything in particular, or he was thinking about too many things to name any of them. He heard the door before he saw her. A quiet knock, not tentative, not demanding. The knock of someone who was not certain they were welcome, but was not going to pretend uncertainty they did not feel. He said come in because there was nothing else to say. Philippa Crestwood was 26. He had not seen her in nearly 6 years. At the last family Christmas, he had a memory of her as a quiet teenager sitting near the window during dinner, not unfriendly, just elsewhere. He had not thought about her since. She looked different in the way that people look different when you have not been paying attention and then suddenly are. She said she was sorry to disturb him. She said her mother had mentioned a particular edition of something in this library, and she had been looking for it. She asked if he would mind. He said he would not mind. She moved to the bookshelves along the far wall, and he went back to not thinking. 20 minutes passed. He became aware, at some point, that the silence between them had changed texture, that it had moved from the silence of a stranger in the same room to something he did not have a category for. She was not performing quietness. She was simply quiet. In a house full of people performing various states of composure and grief and social obligation, she was the only person he had encountered in 3 days who seemed to be actually inside her own body. He said, without planning to say it. He expected things. She turned from the shelves. She did not ask who he meant. What kind of things, she said. And something unlocked. He told her about his father the way he had not told anyone. Not the eulogy version. The version he had already rehearsed. The version that was true in the way that curated truths are true, selecting for the things that would land well and editing for the things that would require explanation. The real version. The one where Edmund Whitmore had been a man of controlled silences who communicated expectation through the precise calibration of his disappointment. The one where Callum had spent most of his adult life performing competence for an audience of one who never quite confirmed the performance was adequate. The one where he had felt, when his father finally died, something that moved through his chest that was not entirely grief. He did not name that feeling. He got close to it and then stopped. Philippa said, "Relief is one of the most honest responses to the end of something complicated." He looked at her. She said, "You don't have to make it mean something bad about you." He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I have a eulogy tomorrow that doesn't say any of this." She said, "I know. You should say some of it anyway, if you can." He said, "I can't." She said, "I know that too." She did not stay long after that. She found the book her mother had mentioned. She said good night in a way that did not require a response, and she was gone. Callum sat in the library for another hour. He thought about Genevieve exactly once. The thought arrived, and he turned it over briefly and set it back down. It had less weight than he expected. He did not examine that. The funeral was on a Saturday in late October. The church was full in the way that churches are full for men like Edmund Whitmore, not because everyone loved him, but because everyone understood that attendance was a form of accounting. The flowers were good. The music was appropriate. 3 people spoke before Callum, each of them delivering Edmund Whitmore back to the assembled mourners as a slightly different man. The colleague's Edmund, the associate's Edmund, the old friend's Edmund, and none of them quite the same as the one Callum had grown up beside. Callum stood at the lectern and delivered the eulogy he had prepared. It was fine. His voice did not break. His hands were steady. He hit the moments that were supposed to land, and he navigated the difficult ones with the skill of someone who had been performing composure since childhood. Afterward, people told him it was beautiful. His mother touched his arm and said his father would have been proud. He nodded and thanked them and moved through the reception with the practiced ease of a man who knew exactly how to be in a room without being in it. Across the reception, he saw Philippa talking to his mother. He was not looking for her. He became aware of her the way you become aware of something your peripheral vision has been tracking without your permission, a gradual arrival of focus rather than a deliberate search. His mother was laughing. Not the performance of laughing, not the polite smile she had been maintaining for 3 days. Actually laughing, the way she laughed in the kitchen on Sunday mornings, briefly unguarded, briefly herself. At something Philippa had said that Callum was too far away to hear. He watched that for a moment longer than he meant to. He thought about Genevieve again and noticed that the thought had lost almost all of its weight. He set it down without examining why. Philippa left the following morning. Her parents had a drive ahead of them, and they were loading the car before 9. Callum was in the entrance hall when they came through. He said the right things to Margaret and her husband. He shook Philippa's hand. He realized, as he was doing it, that it was a ridiculous thing to do. They had sat in a library together the night before, and he had told her things he had not told anyone, and he was shaking her hand. She seemed to find it slightly ridiculous too, though she was too gracious to say so. He said he hoped she would come back to visit his mother. She said she would. She looked at him for a moment. Not long, not the kind of look that announces itself. And then she got into the car. He stood in the entrance hall after they had gone and felt the house become quieter in a way that had nothing to do with volume. The weeks that followed were administrative in the way that deaths are administrative. There was the estate. There was the company. There was the solicitor, and then another solicitor, and then a series of conversations with peers about decisions that needed to be made, and that peers approached with enthusiasm, and Callum approached with the particular exhaustion of someone who has been managing things since before they were ready to manage them. His mother was all right. Rosalind Whitmore had loved Edmund in the specific way that people love someone they have built an entire architecture of life around. Not without complication, not without accommodation, but genuinely, in the way that withstands. She grieved in private and managed in public, and occasionally let Callum see the boundary between the two, which he understood as trust. He managed the estate. He did not think about Genevieve. Or rather, he thought about her the way you think about a room you used to live in and have since left. Not with longing. With something closer to bewilderment that he had ever believed that room was the right shape for him. He thought about Philippa more than he had any obvious reason to. Not obsessively. Not in the consuming way of early infatuation. He thought about specific things she had said, the way you return to a piece of music that keeps catching you off guard. The observation about his father's library, that a man's bookshelves tell you more about who he wanted to be than who he was. The way she had said relief is one of the most honest responses without making it sound like absolution or like judgment. Just accurate, like someone naming a thing that already existed. He kept returning to those moments, and he was not entirely sure what he was doing with them when he got there. 6 weeks after the funeral, he called her. He told himself it was because his mother had asked him to pass on some information about a household matter involving Margaret. This was true. He relayed the information in the first 4 minutes of the conversation. The conversation lasted 2 hours. He did not examine what that meant. Not that night. She was living in London now, had come back from Portugal when the firm she was working for lost a major contract, and the math of staying no longer made sense. She was freelancing. She had a flat in Peckham that she described as aggressively modest, and a project she was working on that involved adaptive reuse of a Victorian warehouse, and she talked about it with a specificity and energy that Callum found. He searched for the right word, sustaining. Like listening to someone who knew what they were for. He asked about Portugal. She talked about the light there in a way that made him understand why she had stayed 2 years. He asked why she had come back, beyond the contract falling through. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I think I was waiting to come back. I just needed something to make the timing clear." He did not ask what the something had been. He wasn't sure he was ready to know. They talked every week after that, sometimes twice. The calls started with the practical, her projects, the estate decisions, things his mother had mentioned that he relayed as pretext, and she accepted as pretext without comment, and moved quickly into everything else. History, architecture, the specific texture of grief at various distances from its origin point. Whether his father's library had told him more about Edmund after he died than it had while Edmund was alive. It had. Callum had started reading the books, actually reading them, in a way he never had when his father was there to have opinions about whether he should. He noticed, at some point, that he had stopped bracing for the end of the calls, that he had started them. He admitted this to himself slowly, over several weeks, the way you start something you expect to need. He did not say this to Philippa. He was not sure what he would do with her response if he did. She came back to Whitmore Hall in February. His mother had invited her. Rosalind had taken to Philippa with the quiet decisiveness with which she took to most things she had judged correctly, and Callum had been told about the visit in the way you are told about things that are being offered to you as information, but are also, unmistakably, being offered as opportunity. He had said that was nice. His mother had looked at him with the specific expression she used when she was declining to say what she was thinking. Philippa arrived on a Friday evening when the light was already gone and the house was warm, and Callum had been in the kitchen since 4 o'clock, doing something elaborate with a piece of lamb that he was pretending was not an attempt to impress anyone. She came through the door with a bag over one shoulder and snow in her hair from the walk from the car, and she looked at the kitchen and then at him and said, "That smells extraordinary." He said it was probably nothing. She said, "You've been cooking since 4. Your mother told me." He said, "My mother tells people things." She said, "She does. It's one of the things I like about her." They ate late, the 3 of them, around the kitchen table rather than the dining room. Rosalind's choice, Callum suspected, and the right one. The dining room was Edmund's room in a way the kitchen had never been. The kitchen was where the 3 of them could sit without the weight of the house's formal expectations pressing in. The conversation moved the way conversations move when the people in them are comfortable enough to let it go where it wants. Rosalind talked about a garden project she was considering. Philippa talked about the warehouse. Callum talked about a decision he had made about the estate's tenant situation that he had been uncertain about, and said out loud, for the first time, that he thought it was probably the right one. Rosalind said, "Your father would not have made that decision." Callum said no. A pause. Rosalind said, "I think it's right." He looked at his mother, and she looked back at him, and something passed between them that had been waiting to pass for quite some time. Philippa found him later that night in the library. He was there without having decided to go there, had simply drifted, after Rosalind went to bed, to the room that had become, in the last 4 months, a place where he processed things. She knocked the same knock she had knocked in October, certain enough to announce itself, quiet enough to leave him an exit, and he said, "Come in." She sat in the chair across from his father's chair. She said, "How are you?" Actually, he thought about this. He said, "I think I'm becoming someone slightly different than I was. And I'm not sure if that's grief or just, What happens when you stop performing for someone? She said, maybe both. He said, maybe both. A pause. The fire was lower than it should have been, and neither of them moved to add to it. He said, can I tell you something I haven't told anyone? She said, yes. He said, Genevieve ended our engagement 3 weeks before my father died. He watched her process this, not with surprise, or not only with surprise, with something more careful. The expression of someone who is rearranging information they already had, fitting a new piece into a picture that had been slightly unclear. She said, I'm sorry. He said, I'm not sure I am. That's the part one can't decide what to do with. She said, what do you mean? He said, I mean that when she left, I thought the worst thing about it was the timing. My father dying. All of it happening at once. And I kept waiting for the grief about her to arrive at the same scale as everything else. He paused. It hasn't. Philippa looked at him for a moment. She said, do you think you knew? Before she said it, he thought about the coffee cup, the way it had been placed down, the expression he could not name. He said, I think I had been not knowing for a long time. On purpose. She said, that's an honest answer. He said, you make it easy to give honest answers. I've been trying to work out why. She was quiet. He said, I think it's because you don't need anything from me. Most people who've been in this house since October have needed something. Reassurance or access or a decision or just the performance of a particular kind of grief. You came in here in October looking for a book and you didn't need anything from me, and I told you the truth about my father before I understood I was going to. Philippa looked at the fire. She said, I should tell you something. He waited. She said, I came back in February because my mother asked me to. That's true. But I also came back because I wanted to see how you were. Specifically, not as a family obligation. The fire shifted. A log settled. He said, that's the most direct thing anyone has said to me in months. She said, I've been thinking about saying it for a while. He said, how long? She said, since you shook my hand at the door in October, and I got into the car and thought about it for most of the drive to Dorset. He did not move toward her. Not that night. Not because the feeling was unclear. It was becoming clearer by the sentence, arriving with the particular quality of something that had been true for longer than he had been willing to admit, but because he had spent a long time making decisions about his life from inside the wrong framework, and he was trying, for the first time, to be deliberate. He said, I want to get this right. She said, I know. He said, I don't know what I'm doing. I've been not knowing what I'm doing since October, and I keep finding that I don't mind, which is new. She said, I'm not in a hurry. He said, Philippa. She looked at him. He said, thank you for coming back. She said, thank you for the lamb. He laughed. Actually laughed, the unguarded kind, the kind he had not produced in longer than he could accurately calculate, and the sound of it in the library surprised him. She stayed for the weekend. Saturday was cold and clear, and they walked the grounds, the estate, the fields that ran east toward the old stone wall, the kitchen garden that Rosalind was already planning to reclaim from its winter neglect. Philippa looked at things with the particular attention of someone whose profession had trained her to see structure, and she made observations about the hall that Callum had never heard anyone make, about the way the East Wing had been added by someone who understood the original building, and the way the West Wing had been added by someone who understood ambition but not proportion. He showed her the library in daylight, which was different from the library at night. The same room, different quality. She found the edition her mother had actually been looking for, the one she had been searching for in October, and held it up with an expression of mild triumph. He said, what is it? She said, a 1952 edition of a book my mother has been trying to source for 3 years. She's going to be insufferable about it. He said, take it. She said, I can't take it. It's from your father's library. He said, my father's library told him more about who he wanted to be than who he was. You can take the book. She looked at him. She said, that was my line. He said, it was a good line. Sunday morning, she came downstairs before his mother was up and found him in the kitchen with coffee already made and the newspaper already read, and the particular quality of a person who has been awake thinking since before it was reasonable to be awake. She poured coffee and sat across from him. She said, what time did you wake up? He said, 5. She said, what were you thinking about? He said, whether I'm reading this correctly. She did not ask what this was. She said, what's your read? He said, that something happened in October that I have been moving toward ever since without quite saying so. And that it started in this library with a woman who came in looking for a book and didn't need anything from me, and somehow that was the most significant thing that has happened to me in years. Silence. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. She said, "Your read is correct." He looked at her across the kitchen table. The morning light was coming through the window at an angle that caught the steam rising from both cups. The house was quiet in the way it was rarely quiet. Not the heavy quiet of managed grief, but an ordinary quiet. The quiet of an early Sunday morning in a house where someone had made coffee and someone else had come downstairs to share it. He said, "I want to say something, and I want to say it carefully because I don't want to get it wrong." She said, "All right." He said, "I think the worst day of my life, or what should have been the worst day of my life, the day my father was dying and the woman I was going to marry had already left, and I was standing in my own house not being able to tell anyone the truth about any of it. I think that day put me in a room with you. And I think whatever I was before that day, I am something slightly different now. And I think you are involved in that. Not the grief. Not the difference. You." He paused. "I don't know what to do with that yet. But I wanted to say it plainly." Philippa looked at him for a long moment. She said, "That's the most honest thing anyone has said to me in a very long time." He said, "You make it easy." She said, "You said that before." He said, "It's still true." She set her coffee cup down, not with the careful finality of Genevieve's cup, not with the quality of an ending, with the ease of someone who is not going anywhere. She said, "I'll be in London on Thursday, if you wanted to come." He said, "I'll come on Thursday." She said, "I'll show you the warehouse." He said, "I'd like that." He went to London on Thursday. She showed him the warehouse, a Victorian brick building in Bermondsey that her firm was converting into mixed-use residential and studio spaces, and she walked him through it with the same specific energy she had used on the phone, pointing at structural decisions and load-bearing elements, and the particular challenge of the roofline in a way that Callum found. He had the word now, clearly, sustaining. Like being in the presence of someone who knew what they were for and was not apologetic about it. He thought about Genevieve for the first time in weeks. He thought about the apartment and the coffee cup and the morning she had said us in a tone that contained the past tense. He thought about 14 months of telling himself that this was what love looked like when it matured past the reckless stage. Standing in a Victorian warehouse in Bermondsey, watching Philippa explain the precise engineering challenge of a 19th century roofline with her hands as well as her words, he understood, not for the first time, but for the first time completely, that what he had been calling maturity had been something closer to settling, and that he had not known the difference until he had something to compare it to. He did not say any of this in the warehouse. He said it later, over dinner, in a restaurant she had chosen because she knew the owner and could get a table on short notice, over a bottle of wine that was better than he expected, and food he barely noticed because the conversation had moved into territory that required attention. He said, "I think I spent a long time believing that what I wanted had to look a certain way." She said, "What way?" He said, "Appropriate. Correct. The kind of thing that would have made sense to my father." She said, "And did it make sense to him?" He said, "He never said." That was the thing about Edmund. He didn't confirm or deny. He just withheld. And I kept performing for the possibility that if I got it right enough, he might finally confirm. She said, and Genevieve was part of the performance. Not a question. He said, "I think I loved her. In the way you love something that fits the performance. But I don't think I ever sat across from her at a table and said the actual thing I was thinking." Philippa was quiet for a moment. She said, "You've said the actual thing every time we've talked." He said, "I know." She said, "Why do you think that is?" He said, "I think it's you. I think it's specifically you. If I asked you to pause right now, and I need you to, actually, just for a moment, and think about the last time you said the actual thing you were thinking to someone who genuinely wanted to hear it. Not the managed version. Not the version that had been edited for palatability. The real one. Most people, if they're honest, would have to reach back further than they'd like. That gap, between what we carry and what we say, is where this story lives. Because what happened between Callum Whitmore and Philippa Crestwood is not a story about two people falling in love at a funeral. It is a story about two people who found, in the strangest possible circumstances, the specific conditions under which they could stop performing. and those conditions turned out to matter more than anything else. He did not kiss her that night. He walked her back to her flat in Peckham, aggressively modest, she had said, and it was also completely itself, full of drawings and reference books and a plant she had named something Portuguese that she could not quite remember, and he said goodnight at the door in a way that was deliberate and not ambiguous. She said, "You're doing the careful thing again." He said, "Yes." She said, "I respect it." He said, "I'll call you tomorrow." She said, "I know." He called the next morning. He said, "I want to get this right." She said, "You said that before." He said, "Still true." She said, "What does getting it right look like to you?" He said, "Not rushing into something because my life has been strange for 6 months and you are the best thing in it." She said, "That's very sensible." He said, "I'm not finished." She said, "All right." He said, "Getting it right also looks like telling you that I am fairly certain, more certain than I have been about most things in a while, that this is real. Not a grief response. Not comfort mistaken for something else. Real." A pause. She said, "I know." He said, "How?" She said, "Because you asked me about the warehouse roofline for 40 minutes at dinner and you were genuinely interested. Nobody is genuinely interested in Victorian rooflines for grief-related reasons." He laughed. She said, "Also because you're calling me at 8 in the morning instead of waiting until it seems more casual." He said, "I was going to wait until 9. She said, "I know." "What changed?" He said, "I didn't want to." He drove to London the following weekend, and the one after that. The warehouse project progressed, and he learned the language of it, the specific vocabulary of adaptive reuse, of load-bearing decisions, of the ethical question of what you preserve and what you change when you take a building from one life into another. He found that he cared about these questions more than he had expected to, and he thought, once or twice, that this was what it felt like to be genuinely interested in someone's world rather than adjacent to it. Philippa came back to Whitmore Hall in March, and then in April. Rosalind stopped pretending she didn't know what was happening. She started, instead, finding reasons to leave the two of them alone in rooms, which was its own kind of communication. Piers, when Callum finally told him, a phone call in late March, briefer than it should have been, because Callum was still learning how to be honest with his brother, said, "I thought you were still with Genevieve." Callum said, "That ended before Dad died." A silence. Piers said, "You didn't say." Callum said, "No." Another silence. Piers said, "This one, Philippa. Is it different?" Callum thought about it. He thought about the kitchen table on a Sunday morning and the coffee cup set down with ease. He thought about the warehouse roofline. He thought about a library in October and a woman who had come in looking for a book and had not needed anything from him, and in whose presence, somehow, he had said the most truthful things he had said in years. He said, "Yes, it's different." Piers said, "Good." That was all. In early May, on a Saturday when they were back at Whitmore Hall and the kitchen garden was beginning to show what Rosalind's winter planning was going to produce, Callum and Philippa were walking the east field in the late afternoon light, and she said, "Can I tell you something?" He said, "Yes." She said, "I was not in a good place when I came back from Portugal. Not obviously, I wasn't falling apart, I was functioning fine. But I had been in a relationship there that ended in a way that left me uncertain about my own judgment. Whether I could read people correctly. Whether I was good at knowing what was real." He listened. She said, "And then my mother asked me to come to your father's funeral, and I came because I thought it would be fine, a family obligation, a few days. And I found you in that library." He said, "Looking terrible, I imagine." She said, "Looking like someone who was telling the truth for the first time in a while." He said, "That's a generous reading." She said, "It's accurate." A pause. The field was quiet except for wind in the long grass along the stone wall. She said, "I want you to know that I was not. I didn't come back in February because I was lonely, or because you were available, or because grief makes people reach for things. I came back because in October I sat in a library with someone, and the conversation was the most real conversation I'd had in 2 years. And I wanted to know if that was the circumstances, or if it was you." He said, "And?" She said, "It's you." He stopped walking. She stopped too. He said, "Philippa." She looked at him. He said, "I know I've been careful. I know I've been deliberate to the point where it might have seemed like uncertainty. But I want to be clear that it hasn't been uncertainty. It's been I've been learning to trust my own read on things. My own judgment. I spent a long time not trusting it because the person I was performing for never confirmed it. And I'm learning to confirm it myself. She said, and what does it tell you? He said, that what started on the worst day of my life, in a library, with a woman who came in looking for a book, is the best thing that has happened to me in longer than I can accurately measure. He paused. And that I would like, if you're willing, to stop being careful about it. She looked at him in the low May light, the field quiet around them, the house visible in the middle distance with its imperfect symmetry, the west wing that had been built by someone who understood ambition but not proportion. She said, I've been willing since October. He said, I know. I'm sorry it took me this long. She said, it didn't. You needed the time. He said, you're very gracious about it. She said, I know the difference between a man who is uncertain and a man who is being careful. One of them is worth waiting for. He kissed her in the east field with the light going and the stone wall behind them and the house in the middle distance. And it was not the kind of kiss that announces itself as significant. It was the kind that feels, somehow, like something that was always going to happen, like a conclusion that the evidence had been pointing toward all along. There is something that happens to people on the worst days of their lives that nobody talks about enough. The worst days are the days when all the structures come down. The performances, the frameworks, the carefully maintained architectures of who you have decided to be. They cannot survive the kind of weight that genuine loss puts on them. They crack. They fall. And for a moment, sometimes just a moment, sometimes longer, there is nothing between you and the truth of things. Most people rebuild as quickly as possible. They get the structures back up. They reestablish the performance. They go back to the managed version because the managed version is survivable and the unmanaged version is terrifying. Some people, if they are lucky, if the circumstances arrange themselves in a way that could not be engineered and could not be predicted, find something in the rubble that was always there. Not happiness, not resolution. Something more specific than that. Someone who came into the room when the walls were down and saw what was actually there and stayed anyway. That is rarer than it sounds. Callum Whitmore did not find love at his father's funeral. He found the conditions in which love was possible. He found a library and a low fire and a woman who knocked with the knock of someone who was not certain she was welcome, but was not going to pretend uncertainty she didn't feel. He found 20 minutes of silence that changed texture. He found the truth about his father coming out of his mouth before he understood he was going to say it. He found someone who did not need anything from him. And in the months that followed, across phone calls and kitchen tables, and a Victorian warehouse in Bermondsey and an Eastfield in May Light, he found out what it felt like to be known, not managed, not performed for, not submitted to the judgment of someone withholding their verdict. Known. It took him 31 years and the worst day of his life to find out what that felt like. He would not, if given the choice, undo the path. The library at Whitmore Hall still has his father's books. Callum has read most of them now. He finds, in the margins of some of them, notes in Edmund's handwriting. Not personal notes, just marks. The marks of someone tracking their own attention. Dog ears. Underlines. The invisible record of a man engaging with ideas he never shared. He showed Philippa one of them. In October, exactly 1 year after she had first come into the room. She looked at the margin notes for a long time. She said, he was more interior than he seemed. Callum said, yes. She said, I think you got that from him. He looked at her. She said, the interior part, not the withholding. You learned to let the interior out. He said, I had help. She said, you did the work. He said, we can argue about the credit. She said, we can. She set the book down. Not his father's chair, her chair now, the one across from his. And she looked at him across the library that smelled of old paper and wood smoke and something faintly mineral, in the room where it had started, on the anniversary of the day it had started. She said, same time next year? He said, every year. Some endings don't feel like endings. They feel like the moment you finally stop bracing and discover the ground has been there the whole time. That is the only kind of ending worth writing about. And it is the only kind worth having.